Welcome to Moving Forward, conversations on culture, identity, healing, and hope. I'm your host, Linda Anderson, and I created this podcast as a space for real, heartfelt conversations with people who are reflecting, evolving, and boldly stepping into what's next. This podcast was born out of my own journey through seasons of loss, transition, and transformation, and my belief that healing happens when we come together to share our stories. My hope is that these conversations will inspire you to pause, reflect, and find courage as you move forward in your own life. Today's conversation invites us to think deeply about what equity really looks like, not as a buzzword or an initiative, but as a daily practice that's shaped by courage, relationships, and responsibility. My guest is Anthony Robinson, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, an educator, scholar, and practitioner whose work sits at the intersection of systems change, leadership, and human dignity. Anthony leads DEI initiatives that support cultural proficiency and educational equity, collaborates across organizations to foster inclusion practices, and plays a key role in advancing Association of California School Administrators' strategic DEI goals. In addition to his leadership work, Anthony is also an adjunct assistant professor in the Los Rios Community College District, where he teaches English literature through culturally responsive pedagogy, universal design for learning, and increased language accessibility, centering the voices and experience of marginalized communities. At the heart of Anthony's work is a clear mission: to empower individuals and communities to challenge systemic oppression and promote social justice with both compassion and clarity. This is a conversation about leadership, responsibility, and the hope that comes from doing the work together. Anthony, thank you for giving some of your time to be here on the Moving Forward podcast.
No, thank you, Linda. That was a great introduction. I didn't I didn't know all of those things about myself, but
You're a busy guy.
it is always an honor to sit in these types of spaces with folks like yourself, and have discussions about DEI, right? And or even just any important conversation. So before we hop in, I do want to greet you with Sawubona. So Sawubona is a Zulu greeting that means both hello, but it also means I see you. And so I'll leave you with this nugget at the top before we jump in, Linda. So when I say Sawubona, your response would be Yebo Sawubona, which means yes, I see you, or yes, hello. So Sawubona, Linda.
Yabo. Okay, here
Yeah,
we go.
yeah.
All right, here we go. So here's my first wonder or question is, Anthony, what experiences or moments shaped how you led when equity, justice, and responsibility are at stake?
Well, I think I can take it back to, there are a number of things that I could look at, but I'll take it back to undergrad. There's actually two situations. So when I was in undergrad, I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Um, so that was a culture shock in itself, especially in the early 2000s. But I had a really close friend who had to do a community service project. And this project was focused on going to a local elementary school and working with fourth, fifth, and sixth grade students. Um, so he asked me if I wanted to go. I didn't have anything to do, so I went. Um, and when I went to this school, one of the things that I noticed is that the students were much bigger than all of the students who went to elementary school with me, or even other kids that I saw. Um, and so, I was very inquisitive. I wanted to know why these kids were so big. And so I had an opportunity to speak with the assistant principal, and she said, well, at this particular school, we don't move students forward until they've mastered everything they need to master to move on to the next grade. And so, I literally did not know what that meant. So I asked her what that meant. And she said, well, many of these students, again, fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, many of the students were teenagers. There were 13-year-old students in fifth grade. There were
Mm.
15-year-old students in sixth grade, and I had never seen anything like that. And at this point, I didn't know anything about special education. I didn't know anything about Nickelby. I was just befuddled by the fact that there were all of these students in this after school program who were almost adults. And so I asked her, I said, well, what happens to these students, once they, turn 18? She said, well, they typically will drop out of school.
Mm.
Um, and so fast forward, I started to learn. I think I knew that that was abnormal, but I started to really learn that that was abnormal. Um, but it was more alarming, right? If you consider the fact that a student who is that age in fourth, fifth, or sixth grade is in a classroom with a 9, 10, or 11-year-old, that should be alarming. Uh, but beyond that, it should be alarming that these students hadn't gotten any of the skills they needed to be
Mm.
successful in school, but considering being successful as young adults. So that was one thing that was planted in my mind. So I'll tell you this, I ran away from education. My family told me as I was preparing to graduate, hey, you should consider becoming a teacher. You're always trying to teach someone something. You love speaking in front of people. You love getting into and you love to tutor kids. Um, and interestingly enough, though I had no money, uh, my excuse for not becoming an educator was educators don't make enough money. So,
Mm.
like, but I will tell you this. The caveat to that is I saw most of my friends leaving Morehouse College, going to Wall Street, going to these corporate firms.
Mm.
Now, I didn't consider the fact that most of them were business majors or science majors, or, I didn't really have a plan. I just knew I didn't want to become an educator. Um, and so what ultimately happened is I started to work in finance. And
Ah.
as I was working in finance, I was working, I won't say the company, but I was working for a very popular bank in the United States. And I was working very closely with high net worth clients. Um, and so that piqued my interest to knowing what financial advisors do. So, um, long story not long, I put in some inquiries. I ended up getting hired by an investment firm. I took my test and I became a licensed financial advisor. And I started working for a very popular financial institution, investment firm, rather. And I was the first Black financial advisor for this firm in the city of Sacramento. This was in 2008. So, in the midst of a recession, the market crashing, I found out that I was the first Black financial advisor. And I'm saying that again because I think in that moment, that's when I really started to understand DEI through the lens of racial equity, right? And so I'll tell you this, Linda, that I ultimately got let go from that firm.
Mm.
And the reason I was let go is because I didn't play by their rules, right? And what I mean by that is they wanted me to build my book of business in a particular way. Um,
Mm.
I decided that I wanted to do it in a more innovative way. And part of that innovation was not only working with high net worth clients, but I was going into low income communities
Mm.
and teaching, particularly Black folks in churches, community centers, nothing that was proprietary, the same things that I was teaching my clients, and I was let go from it.
Mm.
So it was those moments that just really, one taught me about, the importance of DEI, but really opened my eyes to the inequities that exist, obviously in education, but in all facets of our lives
Mm.
as people, right? So those are the things that just really opened my eyes.
So I'm going to not summarize, but I want to pull
Yeah.
out key points that jumped out at me. Number
Yeah.
one, I mean, this podcast is moving forward. Oh my goodness, your story, totally moving forward. And I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
go to the first thing which jumped out at me, which is community service that you gave. I'm a big advocate of that. And look at how that opened doors.
Right.
And then from there, going into the financial part and even opening more of your lens to what you're doing now. Anyway, I wanted to kind of what it did to me listening to you, all these different key points of your beginning part of your life, not really beginning part, but that part of your life that opened the next part of where you moved. So, on that note, how does your own identity, though, inform the choices that you make in diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, especially when the work becomes complex, uncomfortable, or even contested?
Well, I'd say that at the core of everything, I'm a black man living in America, right? And
Mm,
so um, that shapes a lot of the work, right? Because you named off all of these accolades, right? That I am the director of DEI for AXA, that I am a professor, I'm a scholar, all these various things. Um, but unless you're looking at my LinkedIn, or if you know that, or if you're having a conversation with me, I still face very difficult things, right? I was recently in a meeting and I was asked, "What's my freedom dream?" And I
mhm,
really had to sit with that. And I couldn't come up with anything immediately. And then after probably about 2 minutes, and I was in a breakout room with someone, I said, my freedom dream is to be able to know what it genuinely feels like to be free. And
mm,
so obviously, I was asked, "Hey, well, tell me more." And I said, "Well, I don't know what it feels like to go into a store and not be followed around.
mm,
I don't know what it feels like to not have my head on a swivel anytime I'm driving, or have extreme heart palpitations when I see a police officer. I don't know what it feels like to just be able to go into the bank and either make a deposit or a withdrawal without someone having to talk to the manager, or to be questioned about what's going on, right? And I don't know what it feels like to have a conversation with someone without having to lead with my credentials, right? So, and that's just me, Anthony, right? That's so I think about all of the other folks who are not in my financial situation, the
mm,
folks who don't have my education or my positionality at a large organization. Um, I think about the students, who one haven't been taught how to advocate for themselves, um, or even the parents who haven't been taught to advocate for their students, right?
mm,
And I'll take it a step further, right? Because I think oftentimes when we talk about DEI, we relegate it to racial equity only, right? Because that's the low hanging fruit. It's easy to talk about race and ethnicity. Um, but when I think about myself, even as a cisgender man, right? Um, and as much as I can say about being black, there's privilege in being a cisgender man. There's privilege even in my positionality, um, as a director. And I have to often ask myself, how am I using my, even though sometimes it feels like very small privilege, how am I using that privilege to support others? Right. So um, I don't get to take the cloak of
mm,
DEI off. Right. I don't have that fortune, if you will. Right. Even when I'm on vacation, I'm looking at things through the lens of DEI. Right. I'm looking at it's it's like these glasses, Linda, that I can't take off, right?
mm,
If I go to a restaurant, I'm looking to see it, is it accessible for people who may be in a wheelchair, or have
mm,
some other ailment, if you will, right? I'm looking to see how people from the LGBTQ community are being treated in particular spaces. I'm looking to see how folks, I won't say elderly, are more seasoned
mm,
populations, to see how they're being treated, right? How are people who identify as male or female, right? How are they being treated? So I think my identity it is swept up into all of these things because it extends beyond the simple work that I do or writing that I may do. It is a part of every living, breathing moment of my being.
You made the statement of, the accolades in the beginning when I talked about you.
Yeah.
But what really stuck with me that you said too, or that I kind of got out of it, is people see your skin. They see when they see you, they don't know your story. And so and that's with anybody, with anything, like you said, regardless of the color or, transgender, whatever the story is, they don't know the story. So yes, the judgment and is there immediately, which is very difficult and sad because you don't know people's stories and the accolades that you have
Right.
from your bio. So on that note, from your experiences though, and you've had many, where do leaders most often underestimate really the depth of an effective DEI work, particularly when they hold decision-making power?
I'd say most leaders underestimate DEI work as it relates to DEI work at its core just being caring work,
Mm,
caring about people. That's legitimate. So to kind of recraft the question, Linda, I think people overestimate
okay.
DEI. They make it so complex and they make it into something other than DEI work is legitimately saying that people matter
Mm,
regardless of what you look like, regardless of where you're from, regardless of what you do, what you have. At the core, we are all human. We all have to breathe in order to live, drink water, eat healthy foods, move. We all bleed when we're cut. We cry when we're hurt.
mm,
And I think that when people lose sight of that, they lose sight of the fact that equity, inclusion, diversity is important, right? I think the other thing is, I think I think people get so caught up in the language, right?
mm,
Without really having the knowledge of what it means, right? Because diversity, equity, inclusion they're all buzzwords, right? And they are words that have been weaponized, right? And I think that when people get caught up in when people get caught up in what someone else has said is wrong, or they get caught up in rhetoric that says, hey, in order for someone else to have something or to be able to do something, that means that something is being taken away from you. I think that's where the problem is, right? Um, but I will say this, in order to fight for DEI, a person has to be able to do mirror work and they have to be courageous enough to remember their why,
mm,
especially as a leader, especially as an educational leader, right? And I think even in my position, right? I think that I have the fortune of being an adjunct professor. So I get to see students
mm,
pretty much from 18 until. Um, but that's different than my work that started out when I was in K-12, right? I don't teach middle school English anymore. I'm not a speducator anymore. Um, and so I bring that up because I think sometimes when we've worked so hard and we've climbed all these heights, we forget our why from the bottom.
mm,
So I think a lot of it too, Linda, is remember why you got into this work. No one became an educator to become wealthy. You might have had the great fortune to be able to get things and get stuff and and be able to accelerate yourself to a high position. But at the crux of it, DEI work is really about caring about people and acknowledging that people are valuable, right? So going back to your question, I think people underestimate the importance and value of people. Simple.
Yeah. It's really about serving. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's not really in your bio, but you are a true service person that's, serving in so many areas, and that's the caring part, and that helping people understand how important caring really is. Another question I had for you though is how do you make leadership decisions when the need for change really collides with structures that are moving slowly?
I spend a lot of time in deep thought. So I will say this, as I've gotten older, I've recognized the importance of sometimes taking a step back, seeking counsel, right? That has
Uh,
been very important for me because um my nature is to, whether things are moving fast, slow, medium, or not at all, to just go and to bust through walls and to force things to happen. But as I've aged, I've learned that that is not that's not something that's going to fare me well, right? So what I've learned is first and foremost to step back and evaluate, right? Evaluate why things are moving slowly. Um, Again, like I said, seek counsel. Speak to folks who are more seasoned in this work and understand why things may be moving the way that they're moving. Because ultimately, Linda, like it all of this work, all of these things really go back to systems. So why is the system doing what it's supposed to do? Or why is the system not doing what it's supposed to do?
mhm,
I think another piece is really understanding history, right? So when I think about DEI work, I look at a lot of it as cyclical. There might be a new bow on it, a new spin on it, but there's really nothing new under the sun, right? And I think that once I do all of those things, I look to see if there are education gaps for the folks who are the stakeholders or the decision makers. Because oftentimes I find things are moving slowly because people just don't know. And when people don't know, they are afraid. And so if I'm given an opportunity to educate someone, whether it's me talking to them directly or giving them something to listen to, something to consider, something to read. Um, that doesn't necessarily always speed things up, but that at least gets the conversation going, right? Because ultimately, a system, things moving slowly, it's just because someone doesn't even, they don't even, they either don't want something to move or they don't know how to move it, right?
mhm,
So, um, before anything else, I tried to figure out the why. Why are things moving slowly? Um, Now there are times, honestly, after I've done all that, I have to push because I think sometimes, in this particular type of work, folks need a nudge, and they need to be challenged.
mhm,
Um, but I think what it really boils down to is how to effectively challenge folks. I have Anthony's way, right? Or I have the way that works. And honestly, you talked about service, right? I always approach everything that I do with a customer service lens,
mhm,
right? And not the lens that the customer is always right, because sometimes the customer is wrong. But in customer service, you have to figure out the best way to market to your to your client or to your customer. And sometimes my form of marketing is, well, before we talk about the work, let me get to know you personally. Let's go out to lunch. Tell me about your kids. Tell me, like, what do you do when you're outside of work? So a lot of it too also depends on building relationships and building that camaraderie. Because if I'm just coming in as the DEI guy and not as Anthony, I'm not going to ever effectively be able to move anything in any way, effectively. Let me say that I can move things, but I won't be able to move them effectively or in a way that they challenge the status quo and actually affect any type of change.
So you bring up the word why, and I'm a big advocate of that too. Listeners that do know me or don't. And your why helps lends to your story and then the fact that you're moving forward. Keep moving forward. And to the listeners, that's kind of what I wanted to say too and add to yours is what is your why? What is the why? What's your story? And you going back to you of how you moved forward with your why though and your story and how that shared with others and how that took you through your and continues taking you through your journey of and I'm going to go to serving and the caring. So I so appreciate all this message that you're saying. But let's go into your work also as a professor of teaching English literature through culturally responsive pedagogy and universal design of learning, UDL. So my question is, though, is what shifts do you notice in culture and performance when people feel seen, heard, and valued?
Well, I'll say this. So my career as an English professor has been a very interesting one. I pretty much taught every course, and for the most part, and I hate to say this, but this is the reality. Um, I am giving the students that no one else wants.
Mm,
So that could be the students who uh maybe your more difficult students, your students who may go into the financial aid office and challenge folks, go into the dean's office and challenge folks. Um, one of the schools where I teach has right after the pandemic, there was an influx of students from Afghanistan. So a lot of students who didn't have a mastery of English language and didn't really understand a lot of the things that I would be teaching. And so I'll add this piece too. There was some legislation that came out in, I believe, either 2017 or 2018 that eliminated remedial courses in community colleges. So a lot of students who would need to be in those remedial classes would have to come to my class.
mm,
And when I tell you they're remedial to the point where there are students that I have to teach them what a noun or a verb, adjective, adverb are, right? Or how to even how to spell my name effectively, right? But to go to your question, a lot of the students that I get semester over semester, many of them I can tell that they've never experienced what it feels like to be seen or heard because they come in with surrounded in all this armor. Like a
mm,
brick wall is up immediately as soon as they sit down in their seats. Um,
mm,
and many of them, I'd say and this is pretty typical, the first 3 to 4 weeks of school, I am spending just breaking down barriers,
mm,
talking to them individually, doing things that might sound simple to one person, but means the world to others, i.e., learning their names
mm,
and being able to call on them. Um, Being able to reference a conversation they may have had with another student, whether on campus or in the class. For instance, like, hey, I heard you say you had a game on Saturday. How'd it go? Right. So break like chipping away
mhm,
uh, in that way. I like to scaffold my lessons in a way where, well, I'll say this. So to kind of back up, Um, a lot of my colleagues don't really like the way that I teach, and I'll tell you why.
mm,
Because most of my colleagues, they come into the semester and all 16 weeks are fully built out. It is what it is. This is what we're learning. This is what we're going to do. And I do that as well, but I always leave room to adjust. And
mm,
I always adjust to conversations. I adjust to where we are in the learning. I'll create an activity or an assignment just to have students write or freely discuss how they feel about something, right? Like just really using that K-12 brain. I'll ask students, hey, one of the first things that I ask students is in the last 5 years, what is a piece of literature or a piece of anything that you've read and why did you appreciate that? And what I'll do, Linda, I'll bring those things into the class, right? Like let's really take a deep dive, because what I understand is that the learning is for the students, not for me. I'm the
Mhm.
facilitator. I'm the conduit. And as long as we meet the goals that are, set out to move students forward, that's what I'll do, right? So I spend a lot of time shaping and molding my classes around and for the students. And so to your question, what I'll see is a student will come in, and I'm not saying that, they'll go from not being able to write to James Baldwin,
Mhm.
but I'll see a student who didn't even know that there was a tab button on a keyboard to indent, to a person who is able to fully analyze a text. Though, the mechanics still need some work, they'll be able to effectively argue. They'll be able to take what's in the text and apply it to their life, and find that there's a relationship between what we may have read in the text, and a parallel between their lives, right? So what I've seen, and I will juxtapose it to this. So there are times where I have classes that are fully online. And so when those classes are fully online, I don't get the opportunity to connect with the students, right? I
Mhm.
don't, especially if they're asynchronous. It's
Mhm.
I'm releasing the modules, I'm giving you feedback, but there's no relationship. And
Mhm.
so, for the most part, those students might get enough to be able to pass, uh, but I don't see the types of leaps in those students. So, the last thing that I'll say is when the students are feel seen and heard, um, they're able to see and hear others, right? I've seen so many students who will come in and isolate themselves, be the leaders in the class, right? They'll grow into the people who people look to,
Mhm.
or they'll build friendships, they'll build camaraderie, or they'll create their own study groups, they'll take classes with other people. um, I think most importantly, what I've seen from our students who um, I've helped to feel seen and heard is they always come back. And I don't need anybody saying thank you to me, because I do it for the love of education and for the love of people, and the love of students. But they'll come back and they'll say, "Hey, Professor Robinson, thank you for all that you've done. But let me tell you what I did for someone else."
Right.
So it is that constant, paying it forward, and that constant, pride of achievement, right? And I think that ultimately that's what we're all looking for, right? We're looking for a place in a space where we belong, a place where people aren't judging us, a place where we can just securely be who we are and not have to code switch or create an alter ego or
Mhm.
go in the phone booth in order to be prepared for not just class, but just to be able to operate in the world.
Yeah, I call it playing the game. I don't
Yeah,
want to do that. I want to be authentic.
right.
And who is in front of me and how are we going to work this? So,
Sure.
one of the things that I pulled out from that is, well, a couple things. You're the professor, but you're having the kids help you drive that learning.
Yes.
And you said the word that I love, which is facilitator. You're facilitating that learning through their lens. What do they have? And you're listening to their voice. So I so appreciate all those parts. And then with the moving forward, they then, like the student told you, are able to give back also. So that's all that as you help each other move forward. But my wonder to you, though, is because you worked in private and public sector, where do you see the parallels between the classroom and workplaces?
Well, I treat my students the same way that I treat my children. One of the first conversations that I have with my
Mm,
students is the classroom is a means to an end, right? So, or a means to a continued means, rather. Um, So one of the first conversations that I have with students is about not necessarily how you should act in a workspace or
Mm,
act in a classroom, but how to conduct yourself in a way to create partnerships, to collaborate, and to work with people. And part of that conversation is I ask folks, well, what is your goal? Why are you here? You could be anywhere else in the world. Why do you want to be in this class? And if you were to forecast 5, 10, 15 years from now,
mm,
what would you want to glean from me or from this class that will help you in that space? Something that you can carry along with you or look back. And so obviously, I have students who say that they want to be entrepreneurs and they have a business idea. I have other students who want to be engineers or teachers or doctors, lawyer, whatever the case may be. Um, so when I gather all of that information, I said, well, I tell the students individually, well, I want you to treat this class the same way that you would treat that law firm. I want you to treat this classroom the same way that you would treat the classroom that you're going to have in the next few years or, wherever it is that you're working, right? So I spent a lot of time really working on not just the skills of writing or analyzing a text. How are you showing up in the
mm,
class? Figuratively and literally. Are you here early? Or are you showing up 20 minutes late, unprepared? Um, have you completed your assignments on time? Are you constantly asking for extensions? How do you treat others in the classroom when you have to collaborate with them in a group? How do you treat others when they're asking you questions? All of the same skills, the navigational skills that we have to have in the workplace. I start in this small incubator of an English classroom, right? Um, and one of the things that I always lead with is no matter what you do in life, effective communication is the hallmark of success. If you can effectively write, if you can effectively speak, if you can effectively, I'll say argue, but if you can effectively debate with people, right? Those are the skills that are going to help you be successful. But I'll take it a step further. So I consider obviously the education, I consider the workplace that you mentioned, but I also consider the day to day life.
mm,
How do you operate when things are not going your way, when you're angry, when something is challenging, when someone is challenging your thoughts? How do you react when I tell you, "Hey, you could have written an A level paper, but you wrote a C level paper because you didn't feel like really putting your all into it." How do you interact with me in that regard? And how would this translate to the workplace if your boss told you, or if your client or your partner told you that you weren't meeting not only the standard, but if you weren't meeting what you're capable of, right? But I think ultimately, Linda, what I do is I try to meet students where they are and grow them into where they want to be. And it's a lot to pack into 16 weeks.
yeah.
It's difficult, but one of the things that I do when I end a semester, we talk about everything that we've done. And the one thing that I always do is tell students that I'm an open book and that I am always available. I'm not just your professor now. We can morph into a friend later, but I'm always available to you. If you need something, here is the email address. It's going to remain the same. I don't give them a personal phone number, but I give them the college
Mhm.
phone number, right? So that we can continue to build and continue to mold that, not just that relationship, but to build and extend and mold those skills that for the most part started in the classroom.
You've throughout this conversation about relationships and your It sounds like, I mean, I don't know you that well, or I don't really know who you, I've followed you a lot, but you're a total relationship builder. However, my wonder though for you is through all this journey that you've gone through and being a black male and the different hurdles, walls, whatever you want to call it that you run into, what have you learned really about sustaining yourself and your leadership? And the key is without becoming hardened or burnt out.
The key, and I will be completely frank with you. Um, this is a lesson that I learned about 18 months ago. Um, the key is rest. So before that 18 months, I was a workaholic. Like the computer didn't go off until it was time to go to bed. The phone didn't go off until it was time to go to bed. All of the work emails were coming to the phone, and Teams messages and Zoom calls on the phone, on vacation sometimes, taking calls, grading papers, whatever the case may be. Um, and in 2024, I got really sick, really, really sick. And and interestingly enough, even through being sick, I kept doing it. I kept working. Um, and it took me meeting this person named Tovi Scruggs Hussein. And so Tovi, if you hear this, I'm shouting you out like I always do. Uh, and Tovi really taught me what it meant to rest, and
Mm,
that resting is okay. And resting, you know, what I learned from her is resting is not just taking a nap. Resting is not just going to sleep. Resting is saying no. Resting is putting the phone in the drawer. Resting is leaving the laptop at the office. Resting is sitting quietly and meditating. Because to be honest with you, um, burning out is really easy for me. And I'll say this. I heard I'm in a doctoral program at the University of San Francisco. And a little over a year ago, I heard this woman who was she wasn't part of my cohort, but she was in one of my classes. And she was talking about um, laboring and how generationally Black folks have just been taught to labor
mm,
and taught to work, right? And I thought about my family, my grandmother particularly. When I was young, she would say, "Hey, I want you to go to college. I'm first gen, by the way. I
mm,
want you to go to college so that you can get a good job." Right. And just the idea of the good job, and even conversations with other friends and family, you know, about you have to work 10 times harder oftentimes than other folks to continue to build, but also to sustain. And I think also the trauma of feeling like I had to constantly work to stay into position and not be able to bask into the things that I had already done, or be able to enjoy the achievements that I already have, or be able to pause for a moment and say, "Hey, you've done some great things. You deserve a day off," right? So what I do now is I cut the phone off. I cut the computer off. I actually use my vacation time, which was very difficult. I
mm,
actually, if I'm not feeling well, I will take a sick day, right? So this work, especially in these times, is very difficult. Like anytime I tell someone what my actual title is, the first thing they say, "Oh, they still have that?
mm.
Oh, that's still a thing." So, beyond that, right? There are other people who have different responses, but when we think about just what's going on in the world, the fact that people are fearful, the fact that um, Me saying that I'm a director of DEI, I might as well have scarlet letters on my
Uh,
chest, right? I might as well have a sign on my head. And in addition to all the other things that I mentioned. But what I realize is that it is okay to practice self-care. And I know self-care is a buzzword.
mhm,
Um, but I'm still working at it, but it is becoming a way of life for me. So that's how I'm able to sustain myself currently. That's how I'm preventing burnout.
mhm,
Um, and then I'll say this too. Um, because a lot of my work is founded in my lived experience, I don't need to read about it all the time. I don't need I don't need to listen to I
true.
don't need to listen to what I'm already experiencing. So that has helped a lot with my sustainability too, right? Like I can look outside of my window right now. I'm in my office and see things. I don't need to read somebody else reporting about it.
Mhm. Yeah. I so appreciate you saying all this. I retired in June, and as I kind of work with other administrators that are new, I say exactly that. Find time for you. If
Yes.
I could change anything, that's what it would have been, is not work until that 11 o'clock hour, having the cell phone on. So I appreciate that. And I also want to share that my life coach brought up the words to me, blank space. Linda, you need to find blank space. So I just wanted to throw that out there because everything you were saying, I have it in my own head and my own little boxes of what you're sharing. So I appreciate that. Just two more questions that I really have is based on your own leadership journey. What guidance would you offer leaders who want to engage in equity work, but they're unsure to where to begin?
I'd say the same thing that I tell everyone who is trying to be good or trying to learn anything. Use your ears and your mouth in moderation.
Mm,
A lot of this work really hinges on being able to listen. And I'd say also add, be able to see things, but don't 100% trust everything that you see with your eyes, right? Especially in an age of AI. But
mm,
um, being able to listen to folks, right? To ask, not necessarily be concerned about asking the right questions, but being able to ask questions that you really want the answers to. Being inquisitive, asking other folks who do this work or who have done this work, not just about their experiences, but what are the things that I should be reading? What are the things that I should be listening to? What are the things that I should be doing? And what can my role be? Right? Because we all have some sort of privilege or positionality, or some space that we can affect. So asking the right questions about how you can use whatever that space is, regardless of how big or small you feel it is, because one thing that I've understood or grown to understand that um, I see my positionality in one way, the world sees it a totally different way. And sometimes folks have to even tell me, "Hey, Anthony, no, you have a big reach, a much bigger reach than you think." Right. So, um, but I think ultimately, and I said this, Linda, it all really boils down to being inquisitive and being willing to learn.
mm,
Because if you're willing to learn, then you're really willing to do the work. And I'd say I'll take another step. You have to decide how dirty you're willing to get your hands, right?
mm,
Like, are you willing to get into the dirt and do the work? Or are you maybe a person who needs to stand off to the side and watch the work happen first and then figure out? It's kind of like a game of double dutch, right? You have to know
mm,
when is the appropriate time or the proper time or the best time for you to jump in, and are you doing that work singularly? Are you going to do that as part of a group? So I think that learning, just like with anything else, speaking through the lens of an educator, learning, listening, and being willing to be a sponge.
mm.
Those are the things that are going to, make any leader who wants to do this work effective.
So, a final question I have for you, though, is so as you think about everything that we talked about, discussed today, this podcast is called Moving Forward. What does moving forward ask of leaders now? Not in big statements, but in small, everyday decisions that shape culture.
Moving forward, for any leader who wants to do this DEI work, should be focused on that thing that hopefully we all see in the morning is the mirror. And looking in that mirror and going back to the why.
Mm,
Why do you do the thing why did you choose this? Why are you choosing to invest time in your career or in that space or in that community or with those people, whatever the case may be? And
mm,
for educational leaders specifically, I think oftentimes, honestly, to move forward, we have to be able to look back. At least for me, I know that's what it is. I have to stay grounded in that why. Why did I leave finance to become an educator? And I think for everyone, why were you excited about education? Why were you excited about whatever your career is? And how does that connect back to your purpose, whatever your purpose is? And how have you been able to use that purpose and that why to sustain yourself, right? Because there are going to be times where we're going to get lost on the journey, right? Sometimes the position sounds good, sometimes the money sounds good. Um, Sometimes the people around us will make things sound better than they are, but ultimately, when you look back over your life or look back over your career, were you satisfied with what you did or just satisfied with what you have?
mm. What a great way to end this. And let me end with some other words for you, Anthony. I thank you so much for this conversation. It's definitely meant a lot to me. And really for the clarity, the courage, the humanity that you bring to this work. You definitely remind us that equity is not a trend, a training, or even a talking point. It's a leadership practice. And I hope that got across to everybody. One that requires trust, reflection, and the willingness to act when it matters most. And yes, you did that and continue to do that. What stands out to me is your insistence that moving beyond equity means aligning our values with our decisions. And I heard that also quite a bit, especially in moments of discomfort, whether we're leading schools, organizations, teams, or communities. That alignment is where real and lasting change begins. So, to our listeners, I want to say, regardless of the sector that you work in, and really let me get that across, regardless of where you're working, this conversation invites reflection. Where do your values show up in your daily decisions? Where might they fall short? And what could become possible if you choose courage over convenience? These conversations matter because leadership is not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to see, to listen, and to grow. Thank you so much, listeners, and Anthony, for spending this time with me, with us. I hope today's conversation stays with all of you and that it challenges you and encourages you to lead with greater intention, humanity, and hope.